All right, our keynote today is Amelia Rose Earhart. Amelia is one of the youngest women to fly around the world in a single-engine plane and president of Fly with Amelia Foundation. Amelia Rose Earhart's namesake famed Amelia Mary Earhart, who attempted to fly around the world in 1937, is the youngest, one of the youngest. She may tell us, I think this just changed. She was the youngest for quite some time. One of the youngest women to fly around the world in a single-engine aircraft. In 2014, Amelia flew a Pilatus PC-12 NG, 28,000 miles, crossing the equator 6 times through 14 countries to complete a circumnavigation of the globe. Her parents, sharing the Earhart surname, wanted their daughter to have a name that would inspire her to live a life of passion and adventure. And having spent some time with Amelia this morning, I have no doubt you'll pick up on her passion right away. Amelia is the president of the Fly with Amelia Foundation, a nonprofit organization that grants flight training scholarships to young women aged 16 to 18. The Fly with Amelia Foundation also fosters aviation and aerospace opportunities for people of all ages through aviation-based educational STEM opportunities in partnership with Wings Over the Rockies Air and Space Museum in Denver, Colorado. Amelia has been a passionate aviatrix, that was a new word for me today, aviatrix, since her first flight lesson at the age of 21. A seeker of all things adventurous, and is an accomplished public speaker, as you'll hear. She's been around the world speaking and telling her story, so we're fortunate to have her today, and has spent the last 8 years working as a television news anchor, covering breaking news, traffic, and weather in Denver and close to us here in Los Angeles. Amelia was given the Amelia Earhart Pioneering Achievement Award in 2013, and in 2014 was named by the JCs as one of the top 10 young Americans. Help me welcome Amelia to the stage.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm so pleased to be here. I've had this event on my calendar for several months now, and I got to tell you, coming to an event where everyone in the audience literally works to resolve turbulence is a really comfortable place for me to be, right? You guys work in a world where turbulence is the reason that you all come together, right? Managing turbulence. Well, I want you to consider that while we get into our talk today. And we're going to talk about a flight around the world and the metaphors of creating a very strong flight crew. The opportunities of course correction when you encounter turbulence and when you run into big storms along the way. And we're also going to talk about a story that really rips apart identity and what it means to have the opportunity to create our identities each and every day, right? Because it's always up to us, and we always have that opportunity to change it. First, before I get started, I do want to say a big thank you to the entire group who's organized this beautiful event. What a place to come, right? Not all conferences are in San Diego. Trust me, I would know. I'm so glad to be here, though, and of course, thank you to Sedgwick and Kimberly. I appreciate the introduction. I did give her a new word, aviatrix. It's just the female of aviator, but, it makes some people uncomfortable. All right, so this flight around the world, we'll get into all the details in just a bit. But very first, I want to take you back to 2014, right before I launched on my flight around the world. There's a big aviation conference in Geneva, Switzerland, and it's called eBase. It's this international conference where groups like Gulfstream, Boeing, Pilatus, any aircraft manufacturer will bring their aircraft to display not only the planes themselves, but the latest and greatest technology. And some of these jets out here on the ramp in the middle of the Swiss Alps are worth $60, $70 million, right? So there's a lot going on here. Well, I attended the conference because, fast forward, I had planned this huge trip around the world, this 28,000-mile journey through 14 countries to recreate the flight of person who I was named after, Amelia Mary Earhart. She attempted the flight in 1937. Now, we'll talk about why I did that in a minute. But first, this situation arose because basically I needed to do a press interview. They said, meet us at the airplane, the Pilatus PC-12, which was parked right in the middle of all these big jets. They said, meet us there at about 9 o'clock. We'll do a couple interviews. So I arrive, and it's a conference like this, so I wear a dress, and I'm also a TV news anchor. That's my day job in Denver, Colorado. So I show up, and they have me stand on the steps of the aircraft, and they say, stand here, put your hand here, whatever. And this crowd's developing. You know, when somebody's getting their picture taken, you go, ooh, should I know who that is, right? Well, in this case, no. But the crowd developed anyways, and I heard a male voice while all of this was happening. And in front of everyone, there's about 30 people here, he says, oh, ma'am, I see you taking a picture next to this airplane. Would you like a pilot in your photo with you? And I thought, oh, well, this is going to be fun. So I said, oh, sorry, sir, excuse me, what did you say? And he said, well, yeah, I fly this plane, so if you're taking pictures with it, I'd be happy to show you around, and you can have a pilot in your photo. And if you know me at all, you know, this look. Can you believe he just said that, right? I've been flying for 10 years at this point. Not that he would know, but I said, sir, there is a pilot in my photo. And I kid you not, he leaned over and he looked inside the door of the airplane. And it was at that moment that I realized just how much fun it can be to exceed the expectation that other people have for what we're capable of accomplishing. And the very next day, it felt so good. You know, those trade show magazines that basically people just throw all over the ground and throw in the trash. But I was on the cover. Headline placement, font size, guys, is very important. In this case, not great to have UK disease is catching, right? But that's kind of how it goes with women in aviation. Only about 4% of pilots are women. So that headline of Women's Dreams Fly with Amelia, I'm happy that it was on there at all. And that kicked off eBase, but really, that was the lead up to this incredible journey that at one point in my life, I never thought I could accomplish. And then at one point, here I am taking off on a runway from Oakland, California, about ready to launch on this incredibly difficult and complicated journey. Now, this is Amelia Earhart, Amelia Mary Earhart, born in Atchison, Kansas. She was a tomboy, right? She was out there playing with the boys. She was the one, you've all heard the stories from book reports we did in elementary school. She was out there building, you know, roller coasters off the roof of her house, down the hill towards the river. She was out there doing whatever she could to just stay active and be outside. Now, Amelia had quite a legacy. Of course, she flew across the Atlantic solo. She broke Lindbergh's record. She was an incredible leader because not only was she flying, she was also fashion designing. She was designing luggage. She was a social worker. She was out there in the community, but a very, very private person. But leading up through her life to her 39th year, which is when she disappeared in 1937, she decided to fly around the world. She had married her publicist, George Putnam, and they planned a trip together. They planned it together. He wasn't going on the trip. But Amelia and her navigator, Fred Noonan, would eventually embark on this trip around the equator to prove that women, of course, could fly an airplane as well as a man. Now, fast forward to 1983, when I was born, my mom and dad here, Glenn and Debbie, when they found out that they were pregnant, my mom found out she was having a little girl, and my dad's last name is Earhart, spelled the same, and it was always this story in my family that we shared a distant common ancestry with the original Amelia. So my mom said, great idea, Glenn, we're naming our daughter Amelia Earhart. And my dad says, that is a terrible idea. First of all, she's going to feel like, number one, she has to learn how to fly, right? Number two, she's going to feel like she has to spend her entire life talking about someone else. Well, heck, now I've made a career out of it, right? And number three, he said, what if she feels like she has to fly around the world someday? And my mom said, well, good. On the other hand, what if our daughter always has a positive role model to look up to? What if our daughter, anytime she's struggling with a big challenge, can look back in history and see another woman who did something so monumental for her time that she's always got that positive, just charge of a woman to look back on? And number three, very smart on my mom's behalf, she said, our daughter, when she walks into a crowd, and she meets someone, no one will ever forget her name. True. This is true. Well, Mom went out. Amelia Rose Earhart is what they named me. Thank goodness I got my own middle name, right? We all need a little bit of our own identity. So I grew up very similar to the first Amelia. Southern California and then eventually Kansas. My parents actually got divorced soon after I was born. I was a tomboy. I was playing outside, riding horses with my family, doing anything I could to just, be outside and just enjoy whatever I could about being a little kid that loved to play outside and get dirty. So through the years, of course, with the name Amelia Rose Earhart, you get sent a lot of information about a namesake like that. So people would send me articles. They'd send my family articles. They would, contact me at school. I went to school at CU Boulder in Colorado, and I would get packages, random books and things. And one of my favorites through the years leading up to I turned 21 and took my very first flight lesson because, of course, that pressure really started to kick in. This quote turned into my favorite. Amelia basically said that the reason she was flying back in the 1930s was so that women of tomorrow could fly tomorrow's planes. So through the years, I was getting all this, all this positive reinforcement about being named after Amelia. My family told me that I was named after her, but the question would constantly come up in any conversation. How exactly are you related to the first Amelia Earhart? And I would say, my family says that we share this distant common ancestry, yada, yada. And I got so sick of it. I called up Mom and Dad separately, of course, and I said, guys, you gave me this name. Can we please just hire a genealogist? I'm paying my way through school, buying all my own ramen noodles, working at golf courses to try and save as much as I could, working part-time. I was even a car hop at Sonic, to try to make ends meet, pay for school. So I said, I've looked into this, and I can hire a person to research our genealogy and find out how exactly we're connected to Amelia. And unfortunately, Mom and Dad both said, you know what, we're sorry, we'd love to help, but we just can't. We don't have it in the bank account right now. So I saved a little more, and I finally did hire someone. And I found this woman in the phone book. Can you imagine? There's no reviews in the phone book, right? There's no Yelp. So I found this woman. I gave her all the details that my grandmother helped me pile up. Birth certificates, death certificates, military records. Gave it all to her. She spent a couple weeks on it, came back to me and said, all right, Amelia, here's what I can tell you. You and your family share a distant common ancestry traced back to the 1700s with Amelia Earhart. Your families both lived in adjacent counties in Pennsylvania. And if we really want to find the exact details of how you and your family are connected to Amelia's family tree, we need to go into the European records. That'll cost $3,500. And I'm going, well, I just asked my parents for $500. You think $3,500 is going to go over very well? And of course, the answer was no. But at that point in my life, was right around 21, I felt so good. It felt so good to have just a little bit more of a definite answer of how I was related to this incredible person that people were just so fascinated by, and they wanted to talk about in every single conversation. So things progressed. I took my very first flight lesson at the age of 21 years old. That led to my very first job. Believe it or not, I get to work in TV straight out of college. I think I was a junior, and they stuck me in the news helicopter, covering traffic and weather, and got to run this camera and fly in the left seat while I had this great pilot flying me around. And then I would go into the studio, and I was studying meteorology and learning how to talk about the weather in Colorado. But through the years, these opportunities that started to come up based on that very first flight lesson at the age of 21, Boulder, Colorado, this stinky old plane, this terrible flight instructor that basically laughed at me when I said I wanted to learn how to fly. He was old school aviation, okay? Just crotchety. This is the only way I can describe him. And the plane, it was a Cessna 172. The thing looked like it was falling apart. It had tape across half of the instruments. When something in an airplane says inop, that means it doesn't work, right? A lot of those didn't work. But something magical happened that day. I lifted up off the ground, and for the very first time, I understood what it felt like to have that perspective, that distance between where I was and the ground beneath me. And it really was a beautiful feeling. One thing led to the next. I got this job, and I thought, gosh, I'm making a little bit of my own money now. I don't have to ask for mom and dad. What if I pursued this a little further? So I got the private pilot's license done. I got the instrument rating done. Started working on the commercial license, which I eventually finished after the flight around the world. But in my spare time, while my girlfriends were going to Cabo and, doing fun spring break trips, I was doing really exciting things, like going to Groton, Connecticut to do open water survival training. Because I had secretly, kind of in my own time, because when you put a goal out there and you tell the world, then you actually have to do it, right? But I had started planning the possibility of a flight around the world. Because every single day of my life, and still to this day, people say to me, "Are you a pilot? Are you related to Amelia? Have you flown around the world? What are you going to do next? Are you going to fly for United?" I'm like, guys, I flew around the world. Is that not enough, right? But going back to this point in my life, it was a really neat, test for what my creativity, how far it could take me, really. So I started reaching out to other pilots. And at that point, I only had my private license, working towards the instrument rating. But I found that when I reached out to other pilots in the Denver community and beyond, as soon as I said, "Well, my name's Amelia Earhart, I'm distantly related to the first Amelia, and I'm planning this flight around the world," people were like, "How can we help you?" Right? "Let me connect you with this person. Let me connect you with this person. Let me help build your team and your flight crew to help make all of this happen." And that felt so encouraging. Now, the flight itself took about 2 years to plan. And that was an 18-day trip. We're talking, again, 28,000 miles, 108 hours in that aircraft, all to go around the globe, starting in Oakland. And the route itself was Oakland, Denver, Miami, Trinidad and Tobago, Natal, Brazil, Dakar, Senegal, Sao Tome, Tanzania, Seychelles, Maldives, Singapore, Darwin, Australia, Papua New Guinea, Tarawa, Christmas Island, Honolulu, Oakland. That's just burned on my soul, and I love thinking about that journey. But the 2 years of planning that went along with all of that was so incredibly tough. And one of the things I realized along the way was that in order to do a trip like this with so few hours built up in an aircraft, at that point I had less than 500 hours of experience, I knew I needed a co-pilot. And that is one of the biggest criticisms that I get about this flight. People say, "Oh, great, you flew around the world. Did you do it by yourself?" "No, I had a co-pilot." And they go, And my favorite question, now that I'm 34 and I know who I am and I'm confident and all that, I say, "Really, when was your last flight around the world?" Shuts them right up. It's beautiful. But I kept going back to that quote, right? The other criticism I got was, okay, you're flying in a modern-day aircraft. You've got GPS. You've got, all this stuff in the cockpit. You can talk to people. Why don't you do it in a Lockheed Electra 10E like the first Amelia did? And I'm going, well, number one, there's only one in the entire world that's still airworthy. Number two, finding parts for that, if it breaks, not easy. It's very expensive. And number three, I went back to that quote I showed you earlier. The reason that Amelia was flying in the 1930s was so that women of tomorrow could fly tomorrow's airplanes. Why on earth would I want to risk my own life, my family? Can you imagine what they'd be thinking if I tried to do it in the same airplane that Amelia disappeared in 1937? So I chose to do it in the most modern aircraft I could get my hands on, which turned out to be the PC-12. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But in order to find a co-pilot, it was a pretty tough process because insurance-wise, I needed to find somebody who met a very strict requirement. 6,700 hours in the Pilatus PC-12 NG, which is this plane that had just come out a few years ago. So it wasn't easy to find someone that could even qualify. There were 3 people. The first was a gentleman from France he had ferried airplanes back and forth across the North Atlantic to get them into Colorado, where they're configured with all their interior specs. But I had one phone call with him, and let me tell you, I felt like I was on the phone with Pepe Le Pew. He was like, I pictured him with like a cigarette and a leather jacket and tight pants. And because he said this thing to me on the phone, he said, "Oh, it'll be great. You'll sit there, I'll fly, we'll get it done, it'll be safe." And I'm like, no. I've planned this trip. I was given this burden of this name just let me fly the darn plane, right? So I knew he wasn't going to be the best fit. The second person I contacted had all the experience and qualified for this literally $20 million insurance policy with Lockton. Okay, they were one of my sponsors. They did a great job with it, but they said, look, we've got to meet this requirement. This is a $4.5 million airplane that you're borrowing, right? Because I started contacting aircraft manufacturers. I started contacting groups like Honeywell Aerospace and Jeppesen to help me plan the route. So the second person I contacted said, you know what, Amelia, my dad just passed away and I'm taking over the family business. So I would love to, but I can't. And the third person I called, Mr. Shane Jordan, he's the one in the middle, in case you're wondering. Imagine getting this phone call, right? You've been flying for a long time, and he loves the Pilates as well, but imagine getting a voicemail that says, hi, Shane, you don't know me, but my name is Amelia Earhart, and I'm wondering if you'd like to join me on a flight around the world. Why on earth did he say yes, right? It all worked out in the end. We never flew together before the flight around the world. And I'm proud to say this. Your group of professionals, you work hard to create relationships. I paid Shane to come with me. This wasn't a volunteer thing. I paid him same rate as he would charge to fly a corporate client if he was doing a big trip. And I was proud to do that because on my own, I raised close to $2 million to make that trip happen. And it took a lot of convincing because, of course, there's a lot of risk that goes into this. If anything happens, can you imagine Pilates, after they said yes, imagine if something terrible happened. They would be known as the aircraft manufacturer that made the plane that went down who knows where, right? It would be terrible. So they took a big risk on me. The reason, after meeting Shane and having a few conversations with him, the reason I knew that he was the best choice as a part of my flight crew, which of course are the people that we need to trust the most when we're working towards a big goal, is when I asked Shane, he said, Amelia, I've thought about it. I'd love to do it with you, but there are two people I need to get permission from first. And it was his son and his daughter. And that's when I knew this is a good guy, right? He said, I'm just here in case something terrible happens to you. I'm not going to take over this flight. This is your journey. And it was amazing. Tiny little cockpit, about this big, maybe a little bigger. We became very close friends very quickly, right? This is something the kids always ask about if I, go talk to schools or whatever. We had to take a lot of things out of the airplane to make it all work weight-wise. And one of those things was the bathroom. So you put two strangers in a plane for 18 days, it gets a little weird. So leading up to the trip, I was so excited, right? All of these little parts and pieces were coming together. And I put this list up on the screen, not so that you read each and every one or dwell on any one in particular, but just to give you an idea of, while working a day job at the TV news station, getting up at 2:30 in the morning, which I still do to this day, and it's still not any easier. I would be done around 12 after anchoring the midday shows. I would start working on this stuff, right? You got to build a website. You got to get your immunizations for 14 different countries. I was poked and prodded on both arms. The nurse that did it said, I've never gotten to do this many all at once. I'm like, great. I'm glad you're happy. So all that to say, this 2 years of planning, 31 years of dreaming, all culminated into the best team possible, close to 100 people. They were all working together to make this trip happen. And I'm looking around going, how am I so lucky? I'm so fortunate to have these people that I trust. I'd studied 100 years of climate data to isolate the 2 best weeks of the year to launch on this journey through June and July, because that's when the weather is the calmest around the equator, the intertropical convergence zone. You get really good tailwind, so you can be very efficient with your fuel. All this stuff came together. And then it all came to a screeching halt. Now, the slides are blank on purpose. What happened next is the biggest form of turbulence that I've ever felt. And I'm sure I'll feel more, but up until this point in my life, I had never experienced something that rocked me so violently. I got a phone call leading up to the trip from the Today Show. And as a news person and as a pilot who's about ready to fly around the world, this is like the best call ever, right? You want to sit on that white couch. Natalie was there, Al, Savannah. Savannah wasn't there yet. Matt Lauer. You sit on the couch, and it goes by. It feels like about 10 seconds, right? So I flew out to New York. We sit down. We do the interview. They say, so, Amelia, This trip you're going on, tell us your route. Which type of airplane are you going to fly? And then they said, how are you related to Amelia Earhart? And I said, well, my family shares a distant common ancestry traced back to the 1700s, and we lived in, our families were in adjacent counties in Pennsylvania. Gave my normal spiel. They said, oh, cool. Tell us more about the plane. What are you going to have inside? What are you going to bring with you? I left on cloud 9, right? You're floating out of the Today Show. Getting back to the airport, you sit on the plane, and I'm like, when you just want to tell a stranger your good news, but you don't want to be that person on a plane that's like talking. I'm just fidgety. And the person next to me slept the whole way, but that's fine. Now I get to tell you guys. So I get back to Denver and turn my phone back on, and this is all in 2014. I have voicemails, text messages, get to the TV station immediately. My news managers, my general manager, as well as our news director said, it's time for you to come down. We have reason to believe that you lied on national television. And I'm going, lied about what? We have reason to believe that your ancestry about your relation to Amelia Earhart isn't true. And I'm going, well, I had this genealogist study it for me. My family has always told me the story of how we're related to Amelia. Heck, our last names are spelled the same. How could there be, with all of this evidence, how could there be anything about this story that I didn't know about? Well, it turns out that one of my coworkers, who didn't like all the attention around the flight, being on the Today Show, taking all this time off from work, he considers himself to be an amateur genealogist, and he went ahead, without ever speaking to me once, and dove into my family history. He researched and researched and researched, and without ever running it by a producer or a manager, said live on television at the end of the 5 o'clock news when everyone's getting home from work, and that's one of our biggest shows during the 24-hour period, he said, Amelia's not related to the first Amelia Earhart. It was something I didn't even see. So I get off this airplane and the whole world suddenly is criticizing me. Messages like this popping up on Twitter and Facebook and everywhere, emails directly to my news accounts. Things like, way to go, you got a free flight around the world by lying about who you are. And I'm going, what? So my managers at the TV station said, Amelia, you've got the burden of proof. This is your name, your research. Hire another genealogist. We need to figure this out once and for all because this is getting very awkward very quickly. And I'm like, yeah, you're telling me. So being an adult at that point, called Ancestry.com, not to sign up for the $19.95 a month job, to get like the top of the top. Let's do this. I've got 2 weeks. Figure it out. The person who did my research the second time around was based in Salt Lake City, and that's where a lot of the records are about family history. So 2 excruciating weeks go by, and these messages are coming in, dozens and dozens an hour. Being on television in Denver doesn't seem like a big deal. I didn't think it was either. Turns out there are a lot of people that had an opinion about this. And then it started going outside of Denver because the next day, after all of this was said live on TV, the Today Show, I'm sitting back in Denver and I'm watching the Today Show, and they actually said, remember that girl we had on yesterday? Turns out she might not be related to Amelia. And they had this terrible little poll on the bottom, like, do you believe her? Do you believe her? And I'm like, what? What? Like, I'm not a Kardashian. What's going on here? And it made me feel so good because Natalie Morales, who I've always loved her and didn't know why, well, it turns out, she said, you know what? I don't feel like she is the type of person to do this maliciously. And I held on to that hope for that 2 weeks, waiting and waiting and waiting for these details to come back. So on my phone, I see a call come in from Salt Lake City. I'm like, okay, it's time. We're going to vindicate this story. We're going to fly around the world. I'm going to show everybody that this is my family story, and I'm going to do this trip, right? I answer the phone. And this is the part where it gets a little tough for me, so stick with me. I answered the phone, and the genealogist said, Amelia, we're so sorry. We really wanted to find this connection for you. but it turns out your family shares absolutely no bloodline connection with the first Amelia Earhart. He said, the woman who did your genealogy the first time, yeah, she found some connections, but she probably wanted to string you along to be able to charge you for European research and going into the bigger records. And I was just crushed, crying. I couldn't call my parents. I was so incredibly mad at them. How could they name their daughter Amelia Earhart and not know how I was related? So I called one of my mentors, this person who has raised millions, if not billions of dollars. I said, Bob, what am I going to do? I've raised all this money. I don't want to be embarrassed by this. This is terrible. I feel like I just need to move somewhere and take on a different identity. And he said, I'm going to ask you one question. On the day you were born, did the FAA walk into that delivery room and hand the baby, you, a pilot's license just because your parents gave you this stupid name? I said, no. He said, that's right. Did they hand that kid an instrument rating and $2 million to do this trip and relationships with 22 companies, some of which are Fortune 500 companies like Honeywell? You did all of this. And he said, the most important thing, and I think about it every day, he said, if you want to be related to Amelia Earhart, then relate to Amelia Earhart. Take on her passion and her enthusiasm and her sense of adventure, and you go out there and you figure out how to make this trip happen. And that is when I realized that the world is changed by your example, not by your opinion. I'm proud to stand in front of you today and say that I called all 22 of my sponsors and had a very difficult and heartfelt conversation with each of them, and all 22 teams stayed on board. And that's right, we did that flight around the world. Because when people know your character, not just the flashy tabloid story that feels fun to share or fun to gossip about, when somebody knows your character and what you really stand for, and they're willing to continue that relationship as part of your flight crew, those are the relationships you need to hold the closest. So I'm proud to say that that flight did go on. And again, today's show, right? Lester Holt comes on at night. Turns out, got to be on the show again. So this is what the plane looked like on the inside. Let me tell you, all the hate mail still coming in at this point. It didn't matter. But I said, you've got a job. You've decided to do this mission. Make it happen. Focus on the airplane. Focus on your team. Focus on that flight crew. So we ripped out the interior of this aircraft. Taking the walls out saves a lot of weight. Taking the floorboards out saves a lot of weight. That fuel tank in the middle, 200 additional gallons of fuel to get the nautical mileage range up to 2,500 miles. And that meant that with only one single engine on that airplane, I could fly across any stretch of ocean in the world, including the longest stretch on the globe, which is between Honolulu and Oakland. With this on board, which essentially was a ticking time bomb, if you think about it, if anything terrible happens, you don't want a big, box of fuel on your airplane. There was a pump on it that would drive that fuel to the exterior tanks, which are inside the wings. Each holds 200 gallons. So we would drain that tank and get it back to the safest configuration and continue to fly. And the views on this trip, let me tell you, they are stunning. Colors that existed on this trip, I like to call them impossible colors. I had no idea they were even out there. Side note, don't ever go to the Maldives with someone you're not romantically involved with. Everywhere you go, rose petals, right? Oh, welcome, fancy plane. I'm like, we're not married. We're staying for a day and leaving. I gotta go. So each day was about 9 to 10 hours of flight, waking up before sunrise and flying until after sunset. When you're flying eastbound at 27,000 feet, about 270 knots, you're flying east, so you keep crossing time zone after time zone. So while you take off at 5, you're not flying just for 10 hours. You're flying for more like 13 or 14 hours on certain days. And those days were excruciating, but I tell you what, they were worth it. And looking out, you can see the propeller blades. The iPhone lens sort of bends them. I'm not sure why it does that. But there was only one engine on that plane. It was a really good one. It was a Pratt & Whitney, the engine manufacturer, who, by the way, manufactured Amelia Earhart's engine on her Lockheed Electra. The PT6 engine is the most reliable in the world. In every 1,000,000 hours of flight, there's one engine failure. And those, for me, were pretty good odds. I could spend all day just talking about the beauty of this trip, but I want to get to turbulence. Looking at these pictures, people thought, oh, this is such a glamorous trip that you made. This is the international terminal in Tarawa. This is like going through LAX or JFK. And the people were so kind and just so curious about this trip. And for once in my life, the first question was not, how are you related to Amelia Earhart? Aren't you embarrassed about that? The question became, tell me about your route. Tell me about this plane. How did you figure this out? Who are you? How are you doing this? And it was so much fun to share these stories. Flying next to mountains like Kilimanjaro in Tanzania and getting a message from the top of that mountain from somebody who also had a little handheld GPS device that would allow me to communicate. Getting a message saying, Amelia, we're on the summit and we're listening to your radio transmissions. And we just want to say, best of luck. We're from Denver as well. And that was cool because that proved to me at that point just how small the world could be. But not if I stayed home. Right? Not if I gave up on the trip and said, they're right, the naysayers, they hurt me too badly, they hurt my feelings, I'm not doing it. The world is larger, your network is larger, the people you connect with are larger, but only if you choose to make it that way. No one's going to reach out and try to connect with you if you're not doing extraordinary things. The storms kept getting bigger. This is a 60,000-foot cloud top. Incredible. The volcanoes, there was a danger of getting stuck in Papua New Guinea, which is the last place I'd want to be. They don't think too kindly of women, number one, in general. Number two, flying airplanes. When I got off the plane, I was met by 10 armed guards, all shouting pilot at me. And I'm saying, me, pilot. And of course, I'm dressed like a pilot. And they're saying, no. They all had AR-15s with them. They were all wearing different mismatching uniforms. I'm like, I don't even know if these are people I can trust. I said to Shane, can you go out and help me deal with these guys? And he's like, I'm not going out there. And along the way, I was getting messages like this. Everything started to shift the moment I went into action, right? I stopped playing into the fear of the opinions that other people had about this journey and action. The world is changed by our example, and these little girls seem to see that. And the white paper airplane in the middle says, I fly with Amelia. This is the crux of the trip right here. This is Howland Island. This is where Amelia wanted to land after she departed from Papua New Guinea. There's no runway left. In 1936, the U.S. government built a runway specifically for Amelia to land on. The storms are so intense that it's gone today. There was a naval ship waiting for her off the edge of the island so that she would land, have a chance to sleep and eat and catch up. And to this day, we still don't have any idea what happened to the original Amelia Earhart. That's the other big should that people say to me a lot. Oh, well, you should go out there and look for her. I don't should anybody. I'm like, you figure out what you want to do. I'll figure out what I want to do. Like I have that fun line about when was your last flight around the world? When people say you should go look for her, I say, you know what? My focus is on what Amelia was in control of while she was living. Other people can focus on her death and her disappearance. I'll focus on inspiring girls, and that is why the Fly with Amelia Foundation exists. I provide flight training scholarships for girls aged 16 to 18 all across the U.S. If you have any daughters or friends of family, whoever, please pass along the info, flywithamelia.org. It's a $7,500 scholarship through any flight school in the world. You just go and get it done, and it's great. And the notes and the pictures that I get are just spectacular. So as I wrap up here, I want to show you a few pictures and the beautiful way that history can repeat itself, sort of accidentally. Amelia here on the left, Amelia here on the right. Amelia showing little girls the cockpit, and Amelia showing little girls the cockpit. I don't need a bloodline relation to relate to this incredible role model that I have. These two walked right on and they said, does this thing have GPS like our dad's car does? And I said, you bet it does. In fact, it's got two. And that's why I came back safely. And then this one here. This really shows the difference in the two cockpits, right? Technology will continue to advance. We will see more and more modern aircraft develop and make it safer and safer to fly. And while we've got GPS and synthetic vision, and we've transitioned from celestial navigation and using very basic forms of communication to let people know where we were. Literally, the one thing in the cockpit that will never change, as long as we have a human pilot up there, The one thing that will never change is the look in the pilot's eye. The look in the eye of somebody who cares deeply about the journey that they have chosen to embark upon. So this photo was snapped just a few seconds before I touched down on the ground 28,000 miles later. I'm so grateful. I don't even know who took this picture, but I found it online, and I'm like, ooh, who has a picture like that, right? That's like right before you finish your journey. I looked outside the window. Mom and Dad are standing right next to each other. Now, I've never seen them together before this point, because they got divorced right after I was born. I'm going, oh my gosh, Shane, somebody needs to go and stand between them. We need a moderator. And he's like, would you just focus on what you're doing? So, of course, Mom got the very first hug. We still, to this day, talk a lot about the name and what it means. Dad got the next hug. Look at his hand. You know, this is a man who has gone through so much turbulence in his life, and he had so much regret about giving his daughter this name and putting this burden on her. We've talked about it. We're still not over it. It's incredibly tough for him because he always says, gosh, you would have had it so much easier. You wouldn't have had to put me through all this worry if I fought harder for you to have a different name. But it was there that day that I said, you know what, Dad, it's okay. And this man here, an unlikely inspiration, an unlikely connection that I had no idea what he would mean to me in the end. See, on day one of my journey in Oakland, where I got to keep the Pilatus PC-12NG in the very same hangar that Amelia kept her Lockheed Electra in 77 years prior to. I got to take off, taxi down the same taxiway, take off on the same runway, new pavement, yes, same location. This man, Captain Tinarello, showed up. He was carrying 2 patches. He's about 5'2", totally bald, as you can tell. He's in his 80s. Walks up to me, never met the guy before. He says, Amelia, I'm wondering if you can take something on your plane with you. And I'm like, oh gosh, you're really cute, but I've done weight and balance calculations for the last year and a half, and I can't take anything on the plane. And he says, it's just a patch. And so I said, sure. He goes, Amelia, take this patch around the world. I have another. And all I want to ask is that when you get back safely, let's swap patches. And I thought, sure, why not? Fast forward 18 days, and all those long miles and all that stress and worry of staring out the front of an airplane, wondering if the engine is going to fail and I'm going to have to use my open water survival training skills. You know, all that stress, it all left my body at this moment. Because when Captain Tinarello walked up to me after hugging Mom and Dad, and the media is just rushing in, there's this huge crowd, CNN, and the whole group was there. I said, hang on, there's something I got to do. And I walked over to Captain Tinarello, and I said, sir, we made a deal. He said, that's right, we did. Here's your patch. Gave me his big hug, and I had to lean way over. He kind of held on to that hug just a little too long. He said, Amelia, there's something I still need to tell you. And where does our mind go, right? He's sick, he's dying, some sort of bad news is coming. Maybe that's just me. Probably not, though. He says, Amelia, there's something I didn't tell you 18 days ago when I handed you this patch. When I was a little boy, I just loved airplanes. I lived in Oakland, and I would stand out here next to the airport fence, and I would just watch them land and take off, and I begged and begged and begged my parents to bring me out to the airport on the day that the first Amelia Earhart launched on her flight around the world 77 years ago. He looked at me and said, Amelia, I have been waiting 77 years to see Amelia come back home to me, and I feel like you just brought her back. And for me, that was worth all the identity struggle, all the hate that was put out there, all the negativity around this trip. Captain Tinarello has devoted his entire life to aviation. He's a civil air patrolman. He teaches people how to fly. He runs the Amelia Earhart Museum at the airport there. And to get his acknowledgement from somebody that I didn't even know I was affecting by embarking on this trip felt so good. He brought a flag from every country that we flew through, an American flag on one side and an American flag on the other to symbolize the safe completion of the trip. And as a news person, I know this. It's hard to make a cameraman smile because they see a lot of bad things. Look at the smile on that man's face. This was an incredible moment. So in the end, it comes down to this, and I think all of you can relate. The industry that you work in, you are dealing with people's most turbulent times. They come to you when they need advice. They need to figure out what their rights are. They need to figure out that struggle of what's next. Kimberly and I were talking before. She said, a lot of people look at workers' compensation claims and assume the worst, right? What you do is calm that situation and make people feel that reassurance that the turbulence that they just went through does not have to continue. And the reason is course correction. 10-degree incremental changes. When I'm in an airplane, and I fly a lot of small airplanes just for fun on the weekends and, just putzing around, flying up to the mountains. When I see a storm ahead, I don't say, 180 degrees, I'm turning around and going back home. I make 10-degree changes. The closer I get to the storm, the more I understand about it, right? You guys are inside of that storm. And when the injured worker comes to you and says, I need advice, what am I going to do next? You're like, I've done this before. I'm a seasoned pilot. I've flown through a lot of turbulence. I've got my flight crew that I trust and rely on. Everybody has a different role. My role was different than Shane's. It was different than the air traffic controllers. It was different than the person fueling the airplane and different from the customs agent. But literally, that flight around the world could not take place unless each one of those flight crew members was there and checked in the entire time to help navigate turbulence. And so it's why I love to say it's time to course correct. Turbulence also means that you're crossing mountains. How many of you have flown into Denver? Right? It's a big connection point. If you fly United at all like I do, it's like, okay, you see the mountains? Everybody's going, oh, I'm getting nervous. Tighten your seatbelts, right? Turbulence is where air is lifting up. Of course it's going to be unstable. When the injured worker comes in and you're starting to deal with an initial claim, they're going, what is all this I'm feeling? What are all these bumps I'm not used to? And if you've never flown into Denver before, you don't understand that. If you've done it a few times, you look at the guy next to you, calm down, buddy, we're fine, right? Those reassuring voices, people who have gone through experiences that we haven't had yet, are the ones who will teach us. And finally, turbulence reminds us that we are in flight. The injured worker would not have a claim unless they had a job that they loved and cared about. If we keep ourselves locked up inside of hangars, we will never experience turbulence. If I would have gave up on that trip and said, no, I'm canceling, I'm too embarrassed, I'm going away, I wouldn't experience the bumps. And it's not the bumps that we should fear. It's staying locked up inside that entire time. And when you think about what goes through your head when you're experiencing turbulence, it's really all about, am I going to be safe? And the people that you work to protect, the people who hire you, the companies that you work with, the injured workers themselves, that's all they want to know. Am I going to be safe? And when it comes down to it, next time you're in an airplane, I want you to think about this. Turbulence, in the literal sense and in the metaphorical sense, is fluid air. Picture a plate of Jell-O, like a Jell-O mold. Shake it, right? It doesn't break. Just like the wings of an airplane, just like our lives. We get through it, we move on to the next thing. And your team members are the ones who can help keep it all in perspective. In conclusion, the final thing I want to share, and I've hit my stopping point here, the most beautiful question that was asked about the flight around the world, turns out it came from my dad. He called me up well in advance of the trip. He said, honey, when you get done with this big journey you're going on, do you think the world will feel like a bigger or a smaller place? And I'm going, Dad, my dad doesn't talk like this, right? I'm going, what? This is too big of a conversation to have on a Wednesday in the middle of the day, Dad. I said, I don't know. I'll think about it. I'll let you know after the trip. And I'm so glad that I can now say, of course, the world is a much, 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 much smaller place if we choose to make it that way. But it is so much bigger in terms of the beauty and the potential to affect others if you choose to make it that way as well. Thank you very much for your time. Enjoy your conference. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you.